Good evening, guys. Welcome to Live and Undrugged, episode 6. As always, we're sponsored by Cannabis CBD, also Mr. James Jeffries. And we are talking to Dr. Victoria Wilson Craine tonight about about advanced grief recovery. And her book. Victoria, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have someone of your esteem on. I'd like to take you back to the start of your journey, really, and just explain a bit about who you are and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of stories, I suppose, are going to come out this evening. The story about why I've got the title that I've got. I'm an academic, not a medical doctor, and my main research was looking at how we can help young people make decisions about their careers and where they might want to go in the future. And I suppose that that's the bulk of my sort of main job that I do now, but it's kind of woven quite neatly into what I've ended up doing as some additional work now on the grief recovery. Because life changed a little bit for us in 2020, as it did for I know an awful lot of people. But early in 2020, before COVID became such a big thing, my young niece, who was 22, was unwell with, at the time, we thought were just sort of flu-like symptoms, sort of headaches and chills, that kind of thing. And she was ill for a couple of days. And then she became sort of quite unresponsive into hospital and ended up in intensive care. And she died a couple of days later of encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain that can come from a viral disease, and then it sort of transmits up to the brain. And that's what she had. And it was all very, very unexpected. As I say, just sort of started off with what we thought was the flu or some sort of strange virus. It wasn't COVID that caused it. She was actually tested for that subsequent to her death. But yeah, life changed a little bit for our small family at that point, because I think we've been relatively low drama. And actually I do say in stuff that I've written about this, that I know an awful lot of shit can happen to people, but shit hasn't really happened to our family that much until that stage. So I lived and still do live about 2 hours drive away from my main family and where she was at the time when she was unwell. So when she was in intensive care, I did travel over and spent time with family. But shortly after I arrived, it was becoming quite clear that there was nothing more that they could do with her at the hospital. Unfortunately, they tried everything they could. So I think the first kind of dawning of realization for me that I was, as I've now described, on the kind of outer circle of grief, was when I was asked to start the communications about her death and try to explain to people that she died. And I was suddenly thinking, hang on a minute, people should be telling me that. This is not me telling them that. What's going on here? I just realised really quickly that whilst I was very, very close to my niece, there were quite a lot of people even closer to her than me, and they were going to need some support during this time. And I needed to support myself to try and support them as well. So things, as I say, swung into action a little bit. She wanted to be an organ donor, which was great. And she'd actually badgered a few of our family who weren't on the register before that time to get themselves registered, not long before she died, completely unbeknownst to what was going to happen. So if anybody's been in this situation where somebody decides to donate their organs, or if as a family you decide that's the right thing, there's an awful lot of communication that needs to happen in those next few hours while they try and work out who's going to be the best recipients, who's going to be around to make best use of what we could from her. So during that time, her immediate family, and that was her 4 parents and her boyfriend and her brothers, were having those conversations with the hospital team. And it was sort of down to little old me to start the communications with my parents. We've still got my parents, so they're her grandparents. And also her boyfriend's parents were around, so we started to sort of talk about who we needed to speak to and who we could talk to. Nobody prepares you for how you talk to anybody about sudden death. That was probably the first challenge. And one of the sort of early phone calls I made, which may sound a little bit odd, but there was a rationale for it, was to my sister, so her mum, and her husband's workplaces. But actually they were quite easy phone calls to make because they were all kind of in the know that something was going on. And I remember my sister saying to me, oh, you know, phoning these people could be a bit of a dry run for what it's going to be like when you tell other people, because they're hopefully going to be understanding and they sort of know what's going on. And as it turns out, it wasn't at all helpful because they did know what was happening. So the next round of people that we tried to communicate with, it was more a case of everyone assumed it was my parents who were in their 70s. So I tried to sort of fire a bit of a warning shot. I might send a text message or something and say I wanted to speak to you, because I was so clear that it was important to do this communication as a two-way thing rather than getting a message. So I send a message saying, oh, I've got a bit of sad family news, is there a good time to speak to you, that kind of thing. Nobody had a clue that it was going to be about my niece. And some of those really early phone calls were just so challenging because I didn't have the words to use and they didn't have the words to use coming back to me either. Probably one of the most difficult calls that I made was to, we've only got a very small family, was to my cousin. And we knew she was abroad, but we knew she needed to know. And we also wanted to tell her because her mum, who's our aunt, in her late 80s, was kind of all over Facebook at the time. We just thought, we don't want her finding this out over social media. So we did hatch quite an elaborate plan about how we could let our auntie know. But that was a really, really difficult one. And again, to get that kind of call when you're thousands of miles away, not really knowing what I was asking of her either. And in the event, she did travel home very, very quickly to be with us and to support us. But I think that kind of communication is probably the biggest lesson I've learned in this, around A, how to deliver that communication, but B, what to do when you're receiving it, because so many people just said, I don't know what to say, or I don't know what to do. And it can be very, very difficult to know what to say and do. And that's really been the premise of my book. And I'll talk about that in a little while, about how I came to do that. But there's a lot in the book about how you can support people who are in those very early stages of shock and grief. And again, if anybody listening to this is thinking, yeah, I wouldn't know what to say, or if you've been in that situation, as probably you have, it's very difficult to feel confident about that. And no one wants to get prepared for this because no one wants it to happen, but sadly it might happen. So I think, yeah, communication is probably one of the really, really big takeaways from this, that I never anticipated I would need to learn and develop communication skills around death and dying. But it's something that I've started to become really quite passionate about, because I realise so few people really know confidently what to do and say.
Yeah, I've got quite a bit of experience around personal grief. You know, losing people, and you know, in unexpected ways and violent ways. And you're right, you don't know what to say. For me, my primary response is just to cry, because never was that good with, you know, getting out my emotions that way. So for me, my fight or flight response is just to cry. And I you know, I don't know what to say, and I don't even remember what other people have said to me to try and comfort me, because it just it's kind of, you kind of glazed over, and you know, shock sets in, and you can kind of hear, but you can't. So how do you deal with somebody that's kind of unresponsive?
Yeah, you can sort of feel that sense of, I certainly from my experience felt like I was in a bit of a fog. You're going around in a bit of a daze, aren't you, at that point? I think if somebody's unresponsive, and actually I think I experienced this with an older male member of my family who just didn't have the words to say and didn't have the words to talk about it. And I've alluded to that in my writing about how to talk to somebody when the last thing they want to talk about is that. And I think it's just about simple things of being there, listening, holding their hand, touching or talking to them or hugging them if that feels appropriate, and just letting them know that they don't really have to find the words. It's just about being there and being present as well in the moment, and being at anything at all that they say, being very encouraging, because I do believe, and I know it's not always culturally acceptable, but I do believe talking about things can help. So if you can possibly open that door, and that door sometimes gets opened by talking about other things beforehand. I was a youth worker in previous days, and one of my stories is always about we had a beautiful art room that we used to do art and crafts in with the young people, and I probably did the best arts and crafts out at the front desk with a piece of paper and a pair of scissors, just chatting away to young people, because if we said, right, we're going to do arts and crafts today, they'd just kind of close down. But trying to actually have conversations with people when you're trying to do an activity is probably one of the best ways to get people involved. So one thing I did with a person in my field of view was made sure we just got them engaged in doing some stuff. So one of the reasons why one of my relatives was feeling very sad about feeling like they were sort of left out of the arrangements because they were, again, a bit like me in one of those kind of outer circles of grief, I encouraged him to have a think about what can he do, what is within his sphere of control, what can he do for him, or to actually feel like he's involved and part of it. And we gave him part of the service to kind of look after for my niece, and he felt like he was involved then. And then with that came some conversation and came some discussion. But I think one of the phrases that I got from the many books that I've read since this happened is about grief belonging to the griever, and try and not impose what you think the person should be either doing or saying or behaving like. It's such an individual experience that it's probably best not to try and have people fit into some kind of category of, oh, they're behaving like this or they're behaving like that. Just kind of go with whatever's happening. If they're chatting, great. If they're not chatting, that's okay. And maybe try and encourage them through other ways, and just give them loads and loads of support whenever they do open up.
Yeah, I don't think you know how people are going to react. I don't think most people know how they're going to react to certain situations and stress. Every situation for me has been different, and I suppose that's like it for sort of everybody else, even though there's probably a sort of a key line that you're set to.
It's just so unique, and it's also quite changeable. One thing I've learned is, rather than asking questions like, how are you, because that's an impossible question to answer really, other than to say, I'm dreadful and I'm never going to get any better, I'm awful. How is it for you this morning? Or how is it right now? I've read other people have talked about might want to develop your own kind of language within your family or your area, and maybe give it a number. I'm a 7 today, or I'm an 8, or I'm a 3, and whatever you decide those numbers mean, just gives you a way of talking about it, rather than having to say, I feel dreadful, I feel awful, because that's probably the starting point, and anything above that's a bit of a bonus. I know between my sister and I, we came up with a code of kind of saying we were okay, and we put it in text messages and stuff and say okay, and that kind of meant, I'm not all right, but actually on a scale, it's livable with today, it's okay today. And that was something, again, that helped us, because, and again, living at quite some distance, you can't see people eye to eye. It's quite difficult to try and get a sense of how people really are, and it's probably much easier to shut down and not say how you are than actually express clearly how you are, even to someone that you're close to.
Yeah, I mean, that, like, experiences that I've had with sort of PTSD and depression and things on that scale, my own mental illness and addiction, I think sometimes it's when I say I'm okay, I'm really not okay, and that's when I'm sort of at my worst in my mind. But I could be showing sort of a blank face, and I think that more people need to learn to be able to see those signs, which is why I want to get people on like you to be able to just educate families on, you know, on this, because it's not something that we would know by looking at someone or talking to someone. I can, you know, I can say that I'm fine and it'll come out nice and dandy, and you know, I can seem like I'm fine, or I can seem like I'm quiet and you know, I'm actually fine. But you know, you never do sort of know. Are there any sort of things that you can look for to be able to see if it's at a scale, you know, to see if,
I mean, I think that response of "I'm okay, I'm fine" is a very useful one for people when they don't want to talk to you, because if you say to somebody, and we do it as a, you know, a question that doesn't need an answer, doesn't it? You okay? Yeah, you know, and actually, I'm not looking for any other answer than yes, you're okay, because anything that's other than that means I've got some work to do or I've got some helping to do. So I think probably somebody telling me consistently that they're okay is a bit of a warning flag. I think to help that is you can ask more of the right questions rather than asking a closed question of "Are you okay? Are you fine today?" Those more open questions, as I mentioned, of, you know, trying to have some sort of scale, or you know, how is it feeling for you today, to try and make it a bit more personal. So there's some of that in you know, neurolinguistic programming about how you might use your words more effectively. And I think some of those things can really, really help, because it just reframes what it is you're asking. So yeah, definitely try and avoid those sort of closed questions, which only give the person the option of, yeah, I'm fine, you know, come back with that, because often they're probably not. I think something else I would just look for is if you get a pattern of that, of "I'm okay at certain times of the day" or "I'm okay at certain times of the week," could be an indication that there's stuff going on, because, you know, I'm just shutting down, I don't want to talk to you. And actually, probably the most challenging that I've experienced is when people do shut down and move away, because it's hard to get away in then back in. So one thing that people did really effectively with me, and actually I've learned to do this with other people as well, is that kind of regular check-ins, because then people are expecting you to ask and respond. Because if you leave it a couple of days, or if you leave it a couple of weeks, whatever your pattern of communication is with that person, it's harder then to pick it up, particularly if they have withdrawn. So I would suggest people trying to think about, okay, well, what is a comfortable level of communication that I have with someone who I know is going through either a sudden bereavement or a sudden loss in that way. And so that could be days, that could be weeks, depending on what your normal pattern is. But somebody did something really effective with me, and it was just a very, very regular text message. And because I knew to expect it, and because I knew even if I'd push them away a bit, they'd still come back the next day, I could be honest with them. So it's that sort of level of consistency at a time when people can be all over the place and not be consistent at all themselves. And I suppose that the last thing with that is to just not try and not get disappointed if you do get pushed away, or if they choose you're not the right person to be sharing that with, because sometimes you want to just be there for somebody, but sometimes you're just not the right person for them. So just accept, but keep your offer open and make sure that you are going to be there whenever they're ready for you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the times, you know, the experiences that I've had, that the trauma response has been to push people away, and it's not something that you mean to do. It's not something that you necessarily want to do. You might want somebody to come in and get close, but I think that it affects you in such a profound way that you just air this, go away, and I think I struggle with that a lot. In a social thing. I'm a member of quite a large church. I'm part of a prayer and ministry team. And I'm really trying to work on my people skills and my skills in noticing, responses from people and how to then respond to that. But, I find myself ill-equipped. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially in a busy setting like a church on a Sunday morning. And I just find that really difficult. Are there any sort of things that you can do to plan to speak? I do apologize. We seem to have lost there. I will try and get Victoria back. We seem to have lost connection. There we go.
I'm so sorry. I think I lost you then.
That's okay. These things happen every now and again. It's something that you have to expect. You froze. What I was asking was, what can we do in a situation like being in a sort of ministry role in a church, talking to people who clearly have problems? How can we respond better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's where sort of elements of the grief recovery method could come into this, because it can be used for people who are in immediate trauma, but I've been finding it most effective with my clients who are at perhaps a little bit of a later stage, where they're kind of reflecting on their grief and they're trying to help their own recovery from that. One thing that it talks about is that the unresolved grief and the pain that we get from unresolved grief is actually cumulative. So unless we deal with it, something else happens, and it's a bit like a pressure cooker, and you put something else in and put something else in, and then unless you actually resolve it, something's going to blow at some stage. So the grief recovery method teaches you to find ways to, we use a phrase called complete on relationships that have been incomplete, and that could be through death and bereavement, but it could also be through other losses, because grief can come about from one of, they say, up to 40 different types of loss in our lives, not necessarily loss of a person through death. So if you're dealing with people who are in your church, and if they've either dealing with something that it's traumatic and it's current and it's live, the method could come into play. But it can actually be a useful way to just open a dialogue about death and dying that we just don't do.
Yeah.
Because in our society, we just don't really have a language for it. We don't make the space for it, and then we need to find a language around it at a time when we're at our most stressed and at our most difficult. So that's why it's quite hard to think then you're going to go away and read a load of books or take a course or do something, because it's just not going to happen. So there probably are elements of the grief recovery method that, without even going through the course, you could learn from the handbook, that would help you start off a dialogue with the people within your community, to help them think about how they've dealt with grief in the past, and then perhaps how that has coloured how they're dealing with grief in the future. Because I felt like one of my role models for grief was a death that I experienced in my teenage years, and it was pretty challenging the way that their nearest and dearest dealt with that, because it was all about lots and lots of tears, lots of language around we will never get over this. And I don't actually believe you do get over it. I think you grow around it. I don't think you get over it anyway. But it was all this sense of, I'm never going to be better. There's never going to be any good to come from anything as a result of this. And I felt when I lost my niece that I felt a lot like that, to be fair. But I've also got my own family, and I'm relatively young. Do I just pack it all in now then? Because we might as well, if that's what we're going to say, if we can't find a way through this. So there may be things within your community's experience that has actually taught them how to deal with grief in ways that aren't that helpful. And much of what society teaches us about death and dying and how we deal with grief is not helpful and not very practical. So some of the myths that we talk about, which is around, replace the loss. So that sort of works with a teenage relationship, that if you fall in love with somebody and then you split up and then, we'll find somebody else, plenty more fish in the sea, all the things like that. But how does that work when it's your granddad who dies? Replace the loss sort of works with pets. I don't really believe you can replace a dog that you've loved. You can get a different dog or another dog or a cat, and it will be a different relationship, but you don't really replace that loss. But we teach ourselves, and society teaches us, that's one of the ways that we do that. And we do that with children. If goldfish die, you might buy them another goldfish, because that's what you do. So there's lots of things within society that I think have taught us ways that we could deal with loss, but it's often very practical, intellectual ways of dealing with loss. So a practical solution if you've lost something is get something else, or a practical solution around keeping busy, for example, because that keeps your mind off it, so you haven't got to think about it. But they're not really long-term strategies that can help you heal this, which is more the emotional loss that you're feeling when somebody dies. So I would suggest, and I'd be happy to talk to your group if you'd be willing to start to just open up that dialogue at a time when people don't necessarily need that help, because then when they do, you've got tools in your toolbox to be able to cope with it. Because I think one of the challenges we've got is we're not taught the right tools. We're certainly not taught the right tools at school to be able to deal with the kind of things we're going to face as adults, and death and dying is probably one of those.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my followers will, they've all sort of lived the same sort of life as me, and done the same things in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about addiction and trauma and grief and loss and shame and around behavior and stuff like that is it's the fact that it's a disconnection, and it's disconnection from yourself, it's a disconnection from your family, it's a disconnection from the community, it's disconnection from whatever your higher power may be, whether you choose to call it God or and I think that's the biggest problem of an addict like me, and the fact that we deal with or dealt at one time or another with grief by self-medicating or these other learned behaviors like self-sabotage, or these were our trauma responses that we went to. I like to put it akin to as like a mobile phone or a personal computer, and when you get it, it's got its factory settings and it runs how it's supposed to run. Mm-hmm. And then you add your programs or you add your apps, and you get it how you want it. But then you can get two things that conflict. Things like grief and alcohol, they really don't go together. They conflict, and they make this thing not work properly. So then you have to reset back to factory settings. And to do that, for me, that's a 12-step program. Yeah. I suppose there are lots of different ways for other people, but for me personally, that's a 12-step program based around AA. But you have to kind of unlearn these coping mechanisms. And I've spoken to people like Jason Edwards, who's a hostage mediator. you know, and he does these negotiations. And, you know, he's given me some sort of ideas on, you know, how to sort of deal with things. But grief is always the one that resets me back, puts me back, because I've never found the right way to deal with it.
Yeah.
You know, even without chemicals, I've never found the right way to deal with it. Like I say, for me, it's just cry. You know, and I know that I need to build a coping strategy to be able to do that, to be able to then take that to other people and get better in my own life and you know, resolution with conflicts and things like that within the sort of community. But you know, you spoke about NLP. So is it as much, not just as much about as what you say, but how you say it and the tone that you use?
I think some of grief support is that isn't the basis of the grief recovery method. Actually, there's a series of action steps. It's interesting you talk about the kind of AA approach, and it's similarly aligned in that there are a number of very deliberate things you can do that can help you with grief. And I think that's where it can be set apart from talking therapies, because there's nothing wrong with counselling, there's nothing wrong with those types of things. But I actually found, for me, all I was doing was talking about it and telling the story over and over again and not really getting anywhere with that. And I've had counselling before for other things and found it useful for that. But actually for this, it just wasn't that helpful, because I had somebody who was very sort of well-meaning and very qualified, but their role was just to listen to me. And I wanted somebody who could tell me some stuff to do to make myself feel better. And that wasn't what that person's role was at this time. And it was frustrating and challenging. And that was how I found the method, really, because again, going back to kind of the academic in me, I wanted something that was proven, that was going to work. And I know we can't prove it's definitely going to work for everybody, but there is an evidence base behind this method that takes you through a number of steps. You first of all explore what you already know about grief, and a lot of that is, as I alluded to, things that probably aren't very helpful. And then you explore what you've done during grief. So as you've said, possibly medication, possibly self-medicating with legal drugs or illegal drugs, or whichever way you want to take that. There's other ways that people do that too. And I think one of mine was around work, because when this all happened, we were going through an extremely busy time with COVID, with work. And I just had the opportunity to totally bury my head and get on with stuff and appear fine. And all those words that you talked about being okay and stuff like that was just so easy to trot out. So one of the sort of alerts for me was just this is not going to be viable long term to keep going at this kind of pace. I need to do something about it. So you do that, and then you look at your kind of totality of grief. You look at all the different losses that you've had in your life, and that could be loss of really tangible things and deaths. It could be loss of your home, if that's happened to you. It could be more intangible things. So somebody who I trained with, she was a fertility coach, and she just said, I spend most of my days dealing with people who are not going to have that dream that they want. There can be other sort of losses of hopes and dreams of things that something has happened and it means something just isn't going to happen in your life anymore. So it could be the breakdown of a relationship that means you're not going to see certain people any longer in your life, and that could be a loss. There's also really positive losses. So even an example I've had with a client was they've moved jobs because they had a promotion, but they were actually experiencing a significant amount of grief that went with that, because the usual patterns of behaviour had just stopped. And that was an active choice they'd made to change jobs and do something different, but it had really quite had an effect on them, on top of a load of other experiences they'd had with grief. So yeah, you plot all your experiences that you've had, and you realise, and we never do this in any other way, you realise kind of the totality of grief that you might have experienced and things that you'd not even thought of as grief. And then you pick one of those relationships, and it's about, as I said before, coming to this kind of completeness on that relationship, which is about things that you didn't say or do at the time, things that you wish you said or did at the time. And then you go through an exercise to try and complete that loss, and you do that with a specialist like me. So you wouldn't necessarily, even if the person is still alive. So I've had clients who have wanted to repair relationships with people who are still living. They don't need to know anything about this. It's about you and your heart and your emotions dealing with that, rather than telling them what you want to tell them. But that's really it. And I've so far, my experience myself, and then with the clients that I've had, people just have said they just feel better as a result of going through this process. And that's all I can ask, really. Recovery, in our sense of the word, is about feeling better. It's not necessarily, as I say, because I don't think you get over some elements of grief. I don't think it's possible. I think you have to just find ways to learn to live around it. So recovery isn't about total factory reset, I wouldn't say, but it is about finding a way through the pain of the loss that you've had. And I think for me, it was the fact that there is, some research that's gone into it, and my own research now tells me from my clients that I've had that it does actually work. And it was a loss beyond my niece that I actually did my first completion with, because I felt like that was a death that happened quite soon after my niece, and I felt they hadn't had any airtime at all, because all I'd been focused on was what had happened with my niece. And the day after I'd done the completion on that, I just woke up and felt better than I'd felt for months. So I do think it works.
Yeah, I think the closest that I've got to that is making, whilst working the steps and sort of looking at people who to make amends with, where to do so, except where to do so would injure them or others.
Yeah.
Making amends where we can. But you have to remember about making amends, whether it's going to do injury to yourself as well. I think a lot of people forget that, making lists about these things that we've done that have not just caused grief to other people, but obviously it causes a certain amount of grief to us. Yeah. Because we carry it in a certain way. Shame, disappointment, all these things can sort of mimic grief, I think, or it does in me. I can't say that it's a fact that it does everybody, but in me, disappointment and hurt and loss, which I've experienced a lot of, affected me in such a profound way that I kind of grieved for who I was or for what I'd lost. My first trauma, my first bit of grief was finding out that I was adopted, and I love my parents very, very much. It's not always been easy. Over the past few years, I was told on my 8th birthday, and I think that loss of identity for me caused that grief. And it is like losing someone that you love when you lose yourself. So profoundly that you don't know who you are, especially when you're still growing as well. How do you deal with, I presume you would deal with children differently to adults? I know people that have had a lot of grief, and their children have gone through a lot of grief. How do we tackle that?
Yeah, that's something that I'm still learning about, if I'm honest. There is a companion program to the grief recovery methods, and it's actually a program that we deliver with teachers, youth workers, parents, other people who want to help children with their loss. So it's definitely about doing things at an age appropriate approach, but it's also a lot of the kind of underpinnings of it are around real kind of honesty and again, a bit of care with language, because I think one of the tendencies we can have with young children particularly is to speak in euphemisms and to not really explain what we're talking about. So, you know, you've lost your dad, which could be awful. I lost my shoe last week, but I found my shoe again. So, you know, there's already a concept of what that word lost means. And if we try and use that with children, it can create even more confusion. So there are sort of ages and stages that we can go through to be sort of a bit more confident. And obviously it's all very individual as well, because children aren't clones either. You know, got to be try and be aware of who that child is and what they're capable of understanding. But most of the work talks about a real level of honesty with children, and part of that is also setting them up for how they might deal with future losses, because unfortunately it's probably not going to be the last time they're going to experience it. So rather than trying to sugarcoat things and trying to present things in ways that we think will make it easier for them, they'll just make it harder in the long run. So yeah, it's definitely something I'm still learning about, and it's a program that I'm hoping to be able to deliver hopefully the later part of this year, because that's what I'd like to do, really, going back to my kind of teaching background of presenting that program to either parents or other adults that are important in children's lives. But again, children that have either been through the care system, or children that have had other challenges in their lives, to add grief with that, it's just another one of those things that could mean you know, developmental delay or any of those sorts of things that we want to try and protect children from as much as we can. So yeah, very, very keen on working towards that, because I think it could be really, really valuable. And if we can help our young people, whether they've experienced a loss or not, to be a bit better about talking about this than we are, we might end up with less of a need for support services when they get to our sort of age, because the kind of the baseline will have been set a little bit more than it has now. So yeah, something I'm particularly keen about, trying to make sure we can do that, but something I'm still learning about as well.
So what about the loss through violence? That's one that is very prevalent in my life, the people around me, but also I have a lot of friends that have lost people to violence and suicide, and I think it's a lot harsher to an extent than you know, than other loss. How do we begin to sort of deal with that?
Yeah, obviously incredibly challenging situation, and it's another one of those sort of sudden deaths. But for me, one thing we do say is we try and not compare losses, because it doesn't really matter. You know, I'm not going to say to you that that's a worse experience than I had, or you're not going to say to me. But it just feels probably more challenging in terms of the layers of complexity that you've got to try and uncover with that. Because if somebody has died, but it's been through something medical, and they've had an illness and they've died from that illness, however quickly that took hold, you don't have, in the same way as with kind of violence, that other layer of possible anger, or you know, I suppose at the very weakest, disappointment, but at the strongest, you know, much more of a sense of injustice about what has happened to that individual. I think around how to try and support those people, it's just recognizing that there's just going to be a number of different layers to that, and this is not just about simply an emotional saying goodbye or letting go to that person. It's about also dealing with that big range of emotions that when you touched upon talking about the AA stuff, but there's going to be, let's say, anger, disappointment, betrayal, confusion, seeking answers, because thinking back to you know, deaths like where people have died as part of you know, organised events and stuff like that, people want someone to blame, usually because they believe that might help them understand what had happened or feel a bit better about what had happened. So I think it's about being prepared to unpack those different things at different stages, and probably getting different experts that are going to be able to deal with that, because it's not just about the grief, it's about all those other sentiments that people might be feeling at various stages. And that's probably a good one to mention about the stages of grief, because have you heard people talk about stages of grief, or have your audience heard about those?
I think it might be a good idea to go over it.
Yeah, so it's probably one of the biggest myths and things that I better understood in the last year or so, because there was a researcher, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talked about stages of death and dying, and it was a very useful way of helping people who knew they were going to die to know the sort of stages they go through. And you might have heard people talk about bargaining and acceptance and those kind of things, and anger. And it was misunderstood, and the way that I've got hold of this, I think it was misunderstood by a journalist who then twisted it a bit, probably not through any malice, through their misunderstanding, that it could be applied to grief. So you then have a lot of people who are actually grieving, thinking that I'm going to go through this in some sort of linear fashion. You know, I'm going to go through the anger stage, I'm going to go through the bargaining stage, and that was never what it was designed for. And I think that has probably been one of the most useful revelations that I've had, but probably one of the most shocking, because I think people around me expected me to go through my grief in a very linear fashion. So they'd be surprised when it was actually much more messy than that. And I think that's a useful kind of takeaway again for anyone listening, that grief really isn't linear and doesn't follow a pattern. And because of the different things that can lead to grief, as we said, you know, if it has been through a particularly traumatic event or through violence, there's going to be so many other things to consider. You're really not going to get anywhere if you're starting to think, oh, well, I'm going to have 3 weeks of this and 4 weeks of that. And then the other sort of myth around getting through the first year is probably the hardest, because in my experience, that wasn't true at all. A switch doesn't flick if you get through the first year and suddenly you feel better. And that actually, I think, puts a bit of pressure on our grievers and makes you think that either you're doing better than you should be, or even worse, you're doing worse than you should be, because you should be further on with this than you are now. And that can be one of the real misconceptions around how people are behaving beyond the death. You know, well, it's been a few months now, surely you're going to be feeling back to your normal self. I don't think people ever do feel back to the normal self. But I think if you are faced with that situation where you have got people who've particularly been facing grief or shock and grief through a really traumatic or violent incident, it will be about trying to break that down and think about, okay, which bit of this is grief, and actually which bit of it is more to do with what led to the death in the first place, and whether I can get some more help from somebody who's experienced with that, certainly.
Yeah, I think the inherent need that we have when we lose someone like that is to want these questions that we have answered, and that's not always possible. In fact, I would say that's mostly not possible, because we don't know why people do these things. You know, sometimes there's a reason that's been twisted out of all context, but other times it's just, you know, the situation is that it's happened, it's a massive shock, and you may never find out the reason. You know, especially when it's things like you know, murder and suicide, because, you know, especially in suicide when people don't leave a note, and you know, you don't know how somebody's feeling, and you know, you want to say, oh well, you know, I wish they'd have come and spoken to me, or I wish they'd have done this, I wish they'd have done that, and you know, life is full of I wish or what if, and I think we have to come to terms with that as much as we have to come to terms with the loss, because it's just not it's just not always possible. We don't know why people snap. We don't know why these things happen. I've lost several people over the past year to suicide, especially on Facebook. And you think you would know what to do if they rang you. And I've had a couple of people ring me that have been in severe, depression and stuff like that, and you can always say what's from your own experience, but I'm not a medical professional. I only know how I've dealt with it in my way, and for all I know, my way might be, I won't say the wrong way, but not the right way. And I think that if you're going to be put yourself in a situation where you're going to be advising people and you're going to be talking to people, or you're going to be teaching, I think you need to be able to have that sit level on you, because I think if you don't, it's going to tear you apart every time. I think that you have to have a certain way of thinking before you can at least even think about other people's pain. I like to be able to help people, and I like to be able to tell people how I've changed my life and how I've done this and how I've done that. And I like to get people on that say how they've done it, so it gives a bigger picture. So what would you say to somebody that might be watching now that is really sort of grieving and maybe not searching for an answer right here and right now, but they're searching for a way to be able to tip the balance back to them being able to step forward into recovery? What would you say to them?
Function. I think first of all, probably to recognize that you're really, really not alone, and there's lots of us out there, and there are the benefit of that is that there are a lot of people out there that you could talk to if you want to talk to somebody. I would, if you haven't considered talking to anybody before, I would really think about why has that been the case, because certainly from my own experience and people within my field of view, talking to people has helped, because it helps you A, realise you aren't alone, and B, there are some things that other people are doing that maybe you've not even thought of that could be really helpful for you. If you are sitting there thinking, oh, but I don't even know where to start with any of that, I'm sure there are things we can put in your show notes about people to contact, who would be a good starting point, and they might not be the end point, but could just be a starting point that can help you and to refer you on to somebody who you might want to speak to. And I think probably it's as simple as that, really. If you are at that point of thinking, I really want to do something about this, I'm confident there are things that you can do. So I would try and seek out that help if you can. And some of those sort of more immediate phone lines that people can call, people like Samaritans and people like that, will be open to listening to you in this state at the moment, even if you're not ready to talk about the full experience that you've had around grief. But they would be somebody that you could ring immediately this evening to speak to. And then beyond that, there are people like me who can take you through the kind of process that I've been talking about. Or similarly, there may be people within your community who've got that kind of skill who can help you with that too, and that experience.
Yeah. I would suggest anybody that's watching that is sort of really struggling, and if we've spoken about anything tonight that has that has affected you, don't sit on it.
No.
Speak to someone about it. Drop a message under here. Drop a message to the page, or drop a message to me. And if there's anything that or any sort of burning questions that you've got, I'm sure I can pass them on to Victoria. Just before we finish, tell me about the book and some of the reasons behind it and where we can get it.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you started off by asking me about my journey on this, and one of the things that I did to try and help me feel better was to write about what had happened to me and happened to our family during the loss of my niece. So about sort of 6 or 8 months after she died, I started to write a book which I've now called 16 Days, and that just alludes to the number of days between her death and her funeral, because some unusual things happened during that time, and we did some things I wasn't expecting to have to do as a family, and it just really helped me to try and write it all down and get it out of my system. And it started off really just as that, as a bit of a memoir, and then because at the time I was also reading as many books as I possibly could to try and help me with this, I started to put little bits of advice at the end of each chapter which could be helpful to other people if you are dealing with people who are in shock or who are grieving in the similar situation to we were. The reason I wanted to write a book was because when I did an Amazon search for aunties and help for aunties when they've lost their niece, or search strings like that, I basically found a lined journal that I could write in, and that was it. There was no book out there to try and help people who I've since described as being on this kind of outer circle of grief. That, to me, I was as close to my niece as I possibly could be, but there were people who were closer than me, and I needed to try and support them. But I was also looking for support myself. So I've talked about it, if you can picture like an onion and layers. There were people very, very close to the centre of that onion. I was a little bit further out, and some of the people that supported me were even further out on the kind of brown layer of an onion. And I've just found that really, really helpful, because the obvious thing, as a family, you all sort of hopefully stick together and support each other, but actually we all needed different types of support at that time, and continuing as the kind of months went on. So I've written the book. It's just got a number of chapters which aren't in any logical order, really. It's just my kind of thoughts about what happened in those days, and it just takes people through the preparations that we had for a funeral that we were never planning to have, and what happened during those times. So it is on it's on Amazon, on Kindle, as well as printed copy, or if we share my website as well, I'd be happy to send out a signed copy to anybody. I have managed to sell quite a number of copies, and people have come back for more, which has been quite nice. People have read it and said, actually, somebody else needs to see this, or I need to pass it on. So that's been a little bit of a surprise to me. This was a totally activity just for me to be involved in, to write this book and to get it out there, but to understand that actually this story is helping other people is quite sort of heartwarming to me as well. And then on my website as well, there is more information about the grief recovery method, if anyone wants to talk about that in any detail too.
Yeah, I'm sure a few of my my followers will come your way. I know there are people out there that watch my stuff that have really struggled or are really struggling at the moment with grief and loss and things like that, so, which is the exact reason I wanted to get you on. And I want to thank you for coming on and being so open and honest, about your journey and for all your wise advice. I'm gonna stop streaming in a second, and then we'll have a quick chat just to debrief. But to everybody that tunes in every week, to those that tune in live, and to those that tune in later on catch up, to all my followers and fans, as always, you're as much part of this as my guests and as I am, and I couldn't and I wouldn't do it without you. I love you guys, and I genuinely love interacting with you. So thank you as always for tuning in. I don't know when the next one's going to be. I will let you know. I do sometimes say when the next one's going to be and it doesn't happen. So, you know, I don't want to put anything out there until I genuinely do know. Although I believe it could be next Monday, but I'm not going to tell you who. And with that, I want to say good night and thank you for tuning in. Cheers, guys.